All right, we finished learning about the cell cycle. The last section in here is called apoptosis, which essentially is cells programming their own cell death. So that's the key learning intention. And after this section, you should be able to describe the whole process of apoptosis step by step and compare at a basic level the two different ways that apoptosis can happen, which we call the intrinsic and the extrinsic pathways. So this little comic shows it pretty well. Apoptosis sometimes happens when cells have dishonored themselves or when they've become infected and they need to break apart and die to protect the rest of the organism. Here's the proper reasons why cells need to die. So firstly, we are making millions and millions of new cells all the time. And for people that have finished growing, if we didn't have cells die, then we'd be making millions and millions too many. So we're constantly replacing cells with brand new ones. So obviously, some cells get to the end of their life and need to die. So there's always a balance of new cells, and then the older ones are dying off at roughly an equal rate. For example, in our bone marrow, we're making millions of red blood cells every single day. The other reason you need to make cells die off is if they're dysfunctional or if they're damaged or diseased. For example, when cells get infected with a virus, often it's the best policy for the organism to kill off those cells as quickly as they can before the virus can reproduce and make more viruses and the infection gets even worse. The other reason would be if there are issues in the cell cycle. So like we learned in the last section, if there's damage to the DNA and one of the checkpoints picks up on that, sometimes they can't repair the issue, and it's better for the cell to just die and destroy itself rather than risk becoming a tumor and causing cancer. And during embryonic development in a whole lot of different animals and other species, cells die off at a particular stage so that the organs can develop in the right way. So here is how hands actually develop in animals, particularly ones with 5 fingers like us. So it starts off with a generic sort of blob of cells, and then step by step, the red cells here undergo apoptosis and die, and that leads to making finger-shaped organs. So the gaps between the fingers die off, and then some more die off, and then even more die off between the fingers, and suddenly we've got our 5 fingers ready to develop fully. So apoptosis is a really useful and important process. There's nothing wrong with cells dying off, and it's usually the best option if a cell's infected or damaged. So what actually happens in the process? It's basically a 4-step process. It's all controlled by proteins, so it's a biochemical pathway. Step 1, once the signal has been given, the cell starts to shrink. After that, it starts to get all wobbly and parts of the cytoplasm sort of blob outwards with this fantastic word called blebs. So these little blebs start to form and protrude outwards in the cell membrane. Then those little blebs break off into individual little droplets of cytoplasm, and the organelles are broken up randomly into all those little droplets too. And we call those apoptotic bodies. Basically, the cell's dead after that, so apoptosis is finished. But the final stage after apoptosis is all those little bodies need to be cleaned up so they don't break apart and cause any extra damage. And it's the job of some really important white blood cells called phagocytes. And they come around, they're patrolling the body, and they pick up dead parts of cells, and they pick up bacteria and whenever they need to. And they're doing it by the process called phagocytosis, which we've actually met before. Remember, phagocytosis is one of the methods of endocytosis, And that's one of the ways that you can bring in large amounts of material across the cell membrane. So they're basically going around like Pac-Man, and they chomp up all those little apoptotic bodies. There's two main ways and two mechanisms that cause apoptosis. So the signaling can come from inside the cell, which is called the intrinsic pathway, or the signal to die can come from outside the cell, which is called the extrinsic pathway. So for the intrinsic pathway, it's also called the mitochondrial pathway, because that's where the signal starts. So the intrinsic pathway will normally happen if the cell senses some sort of stress. For example, it might have DNA damage, and it can't repair it as part of the checkpoints in the cell cycle. So to begin, there's some special proteins that get released from the mitochondria, and that's basically like the go signal that causes this whole chain reaction of apoptosis, and the cell goes off and dies. The extrinsic pathway is also called the death receptor pathway because there are some special receptors on the plasma membrane. So there's our plasma membrane. Here are some membrane proteins, and we'd have some receptor carbohydrates on the end, or some extra proteins on the end, and they sense a signal coming from outside the cell. So once that signal hits the death receptor, then there's a chain reaction that goes on inside the cell, and it basically causes the exact same process of apoptosis, and the cell dies. So the extrinsic pathway normally happens when that cell has been damaged by some bacteria or invaded by viruses. So normally there's some immune cells that come in and give that signal to actually destroy that cell to protect the rest of the body, like we mentioned earlier. Here's a whole lot more detail about the two methods. You don't need to memorize all these pathways, but it does give you an idea of how complex some of these processes can be. So most of these things are proteins that we can see. The whole point is, though, I just want you to compare the similarities. So the extrinsic pathway, it starts outside, but eventually we get down to making this protein here, caspase 3, and that causes apoptosis. And the intrinsic pathway starts in the mitochondria, remember? A whole lot of stuff happens, but again we make that same protein, and then apoptosis starts. So whether we start inside or we start outside, the cell's still going to die with these two processes. So that's apoptosis, but I just wanted to compare it to necrosis, which is a concept people often confuse. So apoptosis, remember, is programmed. It's planned, and the cell's dying in an orderly fashion. Normally it's just that cell in particular, because there's some damage. But necrosis is sort of the opposite. It's when a whole lot of cells die altogether, and it's not programmed and it's not controlled at all. So it's the death of most cells, or most or all of the cells in an organ or a tissue. And usually it's caused by disease, injury, or particularly a lack of blood supply. So here's some necrotic tissue here that looks like it's come from a bacterial infection on someone's skin. You can see there's just a huge mass of skin cells that have all just died out. And that's going to take a long time to heal, and they'll need plenty of antibiotics there. Here's a horrible diagram of some gangrene. Luckily it doesn't happen too often these days with modern medicine. And gangrene can often happen when they've got a lack of blood supply from particular diseases. There's just not enough nutrients getting there, and the cells die off en masse, and you get this horrible looking black tissue. Okay, so that is the process of apoptosis, how it works, and the two different methods that can cause apoptosis to begin.